enough. You can hear me, okay. So my name's Carolyn Cowan, and it's a privilege to be here talking. And just to let you know a bit about me, obviously right now it's quite interesting to notice my anxiety and my nerves, and I'm going to show you stuff around that. I run a private trauma and psychosexual and relationship therapy practice in London, and I specialise in trauma, addiction, sexuality, pre- and postnatal, and couples work. And I am 28 years clean and sober and free of gambling. And I'm also a Kundalini yoga teacher, and I teach around anxiety, trauma, addiction, pre- and postnatal, and sexuality. So my practice is very embodied. My actual work practice is also very embodied. And I think that when we start to look at trauma in the 21st century, what's very, very interesting now is that the embodied part cannot be left out. So how I thought I'd begin is, I am noticing myself, my voice is dry, my heart. The minute I put the microphone on, it was interesting, I was perfectly fine until the microphone went on, and then suddenly I could feel it. So when I work with clients who get triggered, do we all know what it is to be triggered? Yeah, when I work with clients that get triggered. But also I teach four yoga classes a week, and I don't have any issue with what's in the room specifically, but every single yoga class that I teach, I start with a physical movement that actually says to the brain, I'm safe enough. Now, here's a very interesting thing. To be safe enough is a really interesting question. Am I safe enough? Because with a history of trauma, you're never actually going to be safe. And one of the things I will talk about today is that constant hypervigilance. So just sit up, and this is a gift. I give you a gift. If you are a trauma team, or if you are a therapist, this is a major way to say to the vagus nerve. Yesterday, how many of you were here with Gabor? Oh, okay, good. I'm glad I was here too. It was lovely. He means an enormous amount to me. He was somebody who I started to follow about 10 years ago, and it was so fantastic as an ex-drug addict and alcoholic with a really negative sexual history to have somebody say it's not a disease, that actually what happened is why. And I found that and so it was really interesting to be, it's the first time I've been in his presence, but how much that compassion meant is really interesting for me, that it took away this stigma of having a disease. And that's not to say I don't have huge respect for 12-step recovery, because I wouldn't be here without it, but I also love the idea that one's story is part of how you become so fractured. So let's deal with the fracture. I need to deal with my own you know how the anxiety becomes that sort of So sitting up straight, interlock your fingers. And what I want you to do is pull your arms apart so they begin to vibrate. And then keep breathing, but raise your chin, raise your chest, stretch your neck, take your elbows back, keep breathing. When you get to the top, take a long deep inhale. Hold that breath. Push against your left thigh, turn as far as you can to your right, and exhale. Come back to the center, remember that you're pulling. Long deep inhale, push against your right thigh, turn as far as you can to your left and exhale. And then your eyes closed and just come down into your body. And if you're very sensitive, you'll notice about now there's a kind of a boom, and that boom is a massive dopamine rush. And if you stay inside your physical body, you may notice that you can feel all the way down to a tingling in your pelvic floor. And there's a very interesting thing that you've just done. You've just gone into your sympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system, it sounds so nice, doesn't it? And the only way that you can tell which one you're in is that the sympathetic nervous system is a complete bitch. That's how I remember it. Is your sympathetic nervous system is a bitch, and your parasympathetic nervous system is when you've sent in the paramedics. That's how I've always remembered it. So what we've just done, and what I can feel, I don't know, how does it feel? Can you feel that? You've just said, it's okay. So actually, you've done a really interesting thing. You've gone into your amygdala, which is part of your brain, and you've said, no, we're good, you can stand down. And I think, when I think about talking about the path out of hell, or living, what did I call this lecture? Hell Incarnate, there we are. I approached a publisher to write a book, and I wanted to write a book called The Path Out of Hell, and he said, no, it needs to be the steps to heaven, because people don't really want to know about hell. I thought, you have no idea. You have no idea. When you have a history of trauma, you are constantly falling into hell and trying to somehow kind of claw your way out. So what we just did was we just went into a part of our brain that regulates safety, and we just literally went into like the main fuse board and just said, it's okay. Now, this is something I do a lot. I do it personally a lot, and I teach it a lot, whether I'm teaching workshops or whether I'm working one-to-one. Because when you have trauma, if you have trauma, you're going to have an amygdala that's gone rogue. Gone rogue? Do we understand that? Amygdala, it means that your amygdala has basically gone charging off and decided, all on its own, that it's going to make you safe. And that means a number of things. It means that your hippocampus is not quite as engaged as you want it. I'm not a brain scientist and I'm not a brain surgeon, just to be clear. I'm just a trauma therapist. But what I work with is this, the amygdala, when it's gone crazy, when it's become traumatized, the amygdala does not allow us to be still. So it's sometimes very interesting once I start talking. This is my list of things I could possibly talk about. I mean, I wrote it big because otherwise I have to keep putting my glasses on. But I've got 3 pages here of things I could talk about. Because trauma is such an extraordinary thing. But right from the beginning, I think what I want to start with is looking at the amygdala. We have the possibility of having old trauma. Now, old trauma doesn't mean it's tired, and it doesn't actually remotely mean it's tired. It just means that it's stuff that happened a long time ago. You might have been traumatized at birth. You might have been traumatized in your mother's womb. You might have been traumatized when you were a small baby. You might have needed surgical intervention as a child. There may have been abuse. There may have been violence. You may have been born in a war zone. I have absolutely thousands of possibilities of what could have happened just from conception. There's 3 routes for me as a trauma therapist to trauma. The first is generational. So generational trauma, I don't know if you're aware that when you're a fetus in your mother's womb, when you're a baby in your mother's womb, and you are 6 weeks old as a fetus, if you're a girl, you have all of the eggs that you will ever have in your lifetime in your body. So the 6-week-old fetus has all the eggs it will ever have, which is very interesting, because then those eggs are inside you, inside your mother. And so this is one of the reasons that they can say that we can trace trauma, generational trauma, back 7 generations. Wow. Yes? Do you understand? Because it goes back and back and back. And there's a very interesting thing there, because I'm talking potentially, actually one way you can interpret that is just what happens in your mother's womb. If your mother is stressed during pregnancy and you're washed with stress hormones, this actually primarily affects how your brain forms. But also, things can happen during pregnancy that can affect how your brain forms. But equally, your lineage will affect how your brain forms. And now that can be a story of stress. That can be the first place that they did the research about generational trauma was in the Jewish genealogy and genetics. And they worked out, not very long ago, that trauma is actually passed on. And now more recent research is showing that in the female lineage, the trauma is fairly static, but in the male lineage, from the male sperm, the trauma can be passed on actually in the sperm at the present moment. So what's going on at the moment can also be passed on. So one of the roots to trauma is generational. So imagine if your parents have a history, or in your history there's a history of suicide or a history of mental illness, or you've grown up in a war zone, maybe even in just in recent history in Northern Ireland or some parts of Africa, places like that. So that's the first route to trauma. The second route to trauma is, so there's generational, there's gestational, generational, the third route is experienced. Yeah? So generational, gestational, experienced. And experienced is what happens to you. So we have past trauma, from when we're little, all the way up to we are here because Grenfell happened 2 years ago, a really, really horrific present trauma. So we have lots of different ways that we can experience trauma. So it's quite interesting to try and make a map in a short amount of time. The effect of trauma is to create a fracture in the sense of self. Can you relate to that? Mm-hmm. Imagine your physical body has a big crack down the front of it. How you thought things should be, how things are supposed to be, how your primary carers or your social surrounding or your peers, whatever you have, wherever this event or these events happened, the fracture is a complete betrayal of how things are supposed to be. Yes? Do we follow? Now, trauma is quite interesting because trauma can be bullying. I work a lot with boarding school syndrome, people who've been to boarding school and have been through really horrific bullying. Trauma can come from all kinds of things, sexual abuse, sexual assault. So if we have trauma, we then have a fractured sense of self, and we then potentially have I work with 8 types of shame. So Gabor talked about shame yesterday. How I work with shame is that we have guilt. Guilt is I did something, I broke something, I stole something, I lied. That's guilt, yes? Shame, toxic shame, is where we internalize what happened and our sense of ourself is I'm bad. I am bad, I'm fucked up, I have fucked up, I can't do anything right. There's something fundamentally wrong with me, I am bad. This is where the fracture is. And what happens at this point, do any of you relate to shame? Yeah, okay, good. So at this point, if we go into a shame spiral or a shame fold, do you know what that means? When the shame is so bad, when we've been really triggered into shame, this is where we meet hell. This is where we literally fall into hell. So we have the possibility that through the event, past or recent, through our fracture with our relationship with how the world should be, and our physical experience of ourselves, we completely lose our sense of ourselves, we disappear. It got mentioned yesterday. I think an interesting thing to think about is, I would ask a slightly different question. How old do you feel when you're anxious? 8, 4, 10? Yeah. How old do you feel when you're angry? It's interesting, isn't it? And what's also interesting is if you do have a negative sexual history from your childhood, you could also ask yourself, how old do you feel when you're having sex? And we can be really seriously disembodied. And so a different way of describing what came up yesterday is that when we hit shame, when we hit anxiety, because for me as a trauma therapy, shame, anxiety, triggers, obsessive compulsive disorder, and addiction all lie within the same field where we're unable to regulate ourselves. So for me as a trauma therapist, this is what I work with. So when we hit a trigger, when for various reasons we feel that we are not present, we've literally dropped out of this specifically adult state into hell. Do I make sense? Yeah. So the path out of hell is to recognize that these traumatic states and these abusive experiences So obviously, on one level, we can frame all of this through the lens of looking at Grenfell, but as a trauma therapist, there's present trauma and there's past trauma. We drop out of the present. So if I come back to the amygdala, am I speaking in a way that's making sense? Are you following me? Okay. So if I come back to the amygdala, I'm not a brain scientist and I'm not a brain surgeon, but I've talked about and read about this stuff often enough that I know I can say the basics of it. But if you are a brain surgeon and you need to correct me, please do. What I'm aware of is that when the amygdala, take one step further back, I don't know if you know this, but the reason that we have survived to become the most dangerous creatures on the planet, do you know why this has happened? We have overtaken all animals to have almost destroyed the planet. The reason that we can do this is because we have something called a negativity bias. Have you heard of this? The negativity bias is a very, very clever thing. The negativity bias, do any of you know anyone who's normal? Do you? I mean, I meet them occasionally and it's just like, wow, what's that like? What is normal? Well, okay, what is normal? I mean, normal, I think, okay, let's imagine that we're here talking about trauma, and let's imagine that you've come because either you experienced or you're working with trauma. Therefore, trauma is not normal. Does that make sense? Yeah. And those traumatic states, ironically affecting probably 99% of the population, but probably 97% of the population are numbing themselves, yes? Do you remember when you first realized that you were very anxious? I didn't realize until I was about 40. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I got sober when I was 31. I didn't really realize how anxious I was until I was about 40, because I got clean and sober and then I just did everything else to try and manage my feelings. So when I really realized I was anxious, it was just, what a shock. So if we think about the negativity bias, so the negativity bias is something that the amygdala does, its job. If you're normal, so normal, let's make normal with no trauma, no anxiety, no obsessive compulsive disorder, no spectrum disorders. Do we understand what spectrum disorders are? Spectrum disorders would be autism, Asperger's, ADHD, ADD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, yes? That spectrum of disorders. So if you were normal, your brain is 9/10 more likely to look for the negative. That's normal. Do you notice how you might find yourself going, oh my God, I'm just so negative. I need to be more positive. Yeah? You know, I really need to be more positive. We kind of think that we've got to jump. But actually, the negativity bias means that the amygdala is regulating safety. What was that noise? You notice now I've just triggered your amygdala. Did you notice your heart just went faster? Because I just triggered your amygdala. I could really trigger your amygdala. Can I do that? Can I do that? Let me do it. No, because if I just started speaking like this and I moved my hands more quickly and I put my eyebrows up, your heart would just go, oh my God, who is this person? Did it just happen? Yeah. So now, have a stretch. Just do that. Open your eyes. And stick your tongue out. Oh, bring me back. Oh my God. Isn't it? But do you know what's so amazing? If you're normal, that's your negativity bias. Your brain, your amygdala is constantly going, what was that noise? Did they just look at me in a funny way? Is he in a bad mood? What are those footsteps? Does that mean he's drunk? Now, if you have trauma in some form, or if you've experienced any one of the 8 types of abuse which lead to trauma, are we clear? Yeah? Your negativity bias is insane. Your amygdala has got on a horse and ridden off into the sunset. And here's the interesting thing. It's continuously regulating safety. And it never stops. So I notice for myself, I've got a cold. I've got an overactive amygdala. I spend my life regulating my amygdala because I know how to do that. But I got a cold. I've got an ear disorder from how hypervigilant I was to listening. So I'm partially deaf because of listening too much. Do any of the rest of you have this? You may have issues with your ears to do with balance from listening too much. You can have issues with your eyes with squinting from watching too much. You can have issues with your throat from actually containing or not being able to express yourself. The system that the amygdala moderates, yes? The system that the amygdala moderates is this sympathetic system. This is the negative mind, yes? The negativity bias is regulated by the amygdala. So if you have experienced, or you are currently feeling traumatized, or you're trying to come out of some kind of really addictive cycle, you know you're obsessive compulsive, you're waking up with a start in the night, you find it impossible to be still, you can't bear being alone. You're either really high or really low without not necessarily having to be bipolar, just actually finding that you're either really super excited or you're dumping, and that the habits that you have when you're super excited are one thing, and the habits that you have when you're unhappy are another. Your amygdala is in hyperdrive. So now, if I've given you a bit of a background, can you see how trauma becomes hell incarnate? Mm-hmm. Perhaps there's one more thing to add, which is that when you hit hell incarnate, here's the interesting thing. As a therapist, I work with a place. It's a limbic space. Do we know what a limbic space is? Some of you will do, some of you don't. So, as a therapist, it's hard to know how to frame it well, but I work with a space called the hinterland. And the hinterland is a really extraordinary place. The hinterland is, if you were to close your eyes and allow yourself to know where you go when you're frightened, when you're anxious, when you're triggered, you generally will go into the hinterland. And the hinterland is literally hell. Hell opens up, the floor opens. There are 9 layers to hell, and the base layer is a really serious shame fold. And what's really interesting, so this is the limbic space, means that those of you who maybe shook your head, can you imagine what I'm talking about? Now I vaguely talk about it, can you imagine? Is anyone following me?
Yeah.
We can follow, okay. Do you notice that when you have a shame fold, do you notice that when you're triggered, you might feel you're the only person, that you're literally shattered out of social interaction. You no longer belong. You're thrown out into another world, and there's just nothing but the sound of moaning and crying, but you can't see anyone else. It's as if you're in this place, in hell, with blinkers on. Do you relate? That's the hinterland. So that's called a limbic space. And what's really interesting is that that's an extraordinary space to work with. So as a therapist, if somebody was my client who has a lot of trauma, or just any trauma, it doesn't matter. Not that it doesn't matter in a negating way, but when triggered, I know that that's where they are. So sometimes if I'm working with a client who's got trauma, comes with a trauma history, comes with an addiction history, is manifesting OCD or really large amounts of anxiety. One of the things I might do is, rather than sit in a chair, I might go and sit in a corner, just over there, maybe just by those doors, or maybe here, go and sit in a corner, and we'd sit side by side, and by doing that, I allow that person to become the age that it happened. So it's a way of dropping down. And then we sit next to each other. Have you noticed, do any of you have teenagers? If you ever want to be able to talk to your teenager, the thing you want to do is sit in the car side by side with them, and they won't be able to stop talking. It's a very good thing, good way to find out what you want to find out, sit next to your teenager in a car. But as a therapist, if I was to take the client and we'd sit quietly on the floor in a corner, we can drop into this limbic space and we can explore what's going on from that place. Because the thing that's really important about trauma, hang on, let me just look at what we're doing. The thing that's really important about trauma is it's really important to recognize that it's a position of safety. Something really horrific happened, and our brain needs to never forget that it happened. You know, the brain says that it must never forget, yes? And therefore the brain needs to make sure that there's as much safety as possible in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. Does that make sense? But the problem with anxiety and trauma, and when we get to the point where the addiction isn't fun anymore, we know those places, because probably for some of you it's still fun. When it's no longer fun, when we're triggered and we're traumatized, and when we're really anxious, we hate it. Do you recognize this? We really fear. We fear our depression, we fear our anger, we fear our anxiety, we fear our triggers. Because we're thrown away, we're thrown out. And the hinterland is a very interesting space. For me, when I work with the hinterland is populated by drug addicts, alcoholics, mothers, women who've aborted, women who've miscarried, suicides, people who want to kill themselves, people who've hanged themselves, people with anxiety, drug addicts, homeless people, the bin men. Actually, let me hold back on the bin men. Do you get the picture of who's wandering around in the centre, moaning and sad and lost and thinking they're the only ones down there? Around the outer edges of the hinterland, we have the nurses, the doctors, the surgeons, the people who have birthed handicapped children. We have people who do autopsies. Did I mention the bin men and the grave diggers? And they're the kind of people that live around the outside, that pick up our shit. And they're down there, but they know they're down there. They're not down there blindfolded. They're down there and they can see. Does that make sense? And everybody else is in this very interesting space. So as a therapist, if I'm going to work with that space, I will make a staircase. Everyone will design their own staircase out from down there. Where's your staircase? What does it look like? Is it white marble? Is it mossy stones? Is it carved oak? What is your staircase like? Where is it? Point it to me, let's go and find it. And it's a really interesting way to work with this space that on one level is so intensely disconnecting. Do you understand? Yeah? On another level, the space of trauma, anxiety and addiction is intensely physical. I mean, it is intensely physical. To be in this negative mind, to be in this negativity bias, to be with the amygdala overtaking the vagus nerve. Do we know what the vagus nerve is? The vagus nerve is an amazing thing. It goes from your frown line to your pelvic floor, goes through all the organs of your body, and it also speaks to your fascia. And your fascia, let's imagine that we're not all raw vegans and that we go to the butcher and we say, I'd like a chicken, but I'd like you to take the skin off. And as the butcher lifts the skin, you see that white crisscrossing network. And then you say, I'd like a steak, and you see around the edges of the steak this white tissue. Your entire body is, everywhere in your body is covered in it, and it contracts with the vagus nerve, which is really interesting. So then the latest research is that the vagus nerve affects the fascia, and about 8 months ago the fascia was classified as an organ, because it's actually been discovered that it's how our trauma hormones move through the body. Trauma hormones. This is what creates this awful state. We don't say, I think anxious. We don't say, I think angry. We always say, I feel. Because it's all happening from the face all the way down to the pelvic floor. So when we're looking at trauma, when we're looking at these altered states, we have the limbic state of total disconnection and fracture and isolation. We have the physical state of contraction. And then we also have the behavioral state. Does that make sense? In a way, we have mind, body, spirit. And the spirit is quite interesting because we desperately want to get out of it because it's so hideous. But you have to understand that it's a really strong identity. Even if you don't want it to be an identity, it is an identity. And particularly if it's old trauma. We hold on to it because it's safety. Does that make sense? We need it because it's safety. I know those of you who aren't therapists, am I making sense to how important the identity is? And so if you want to take the path out of hell, if you know, yesterday there was a woman, who I remember her standing here with a microphone asking, about how to get out. if you want to take the path out of hell, I always think the first place is to really notice how strongly it is an identity. Which means if you're not abandoned and you weren't raped and if your identity is abandonment, rape, sexual abuse, school bullying, any number of those things, they create a relational space. We actually use them as an intimacy moderator. Does that make sense? Intimacy moderator? Do we understand that word? So, okay, that's okay. Let's imagine, okay, take a view. How many of you experience anxiety? Excellent. Okay, lots of us. We're in the right place. Let's imagine that when you're really anxious, if you're in relationship, I'm assuming that nobody here is an island. Somehow we've either got parents or children or a partner or a lover or friends, yes? Yeah. How many of you use your anxiety to regulate your freedom and your ability to behave as badly as you want? I mean, let's be honest, pretend it's a confessional. Yeah? I'm really anxious, can you just fuck off? Yeah? I'm really anxious, and you're not getting ready for school quickly enough. Could you, I'm really anxious, you don't understand how cross you've made me. Yeah? I'm really anxious, I can't have sex. I'm really anxious, I don't want to go out to dinner. I'm really anxious, I'm just going to look at my phone because I'm really anxious. So we use it as a way of separating. Did that voice get you anxious again? It's good, isn't it? So, if I come back to the trauma being an identity, I am not being pejorative, I am not judging it in any way. As a trauma therapist, I will work with the identity, and the first thing that I would ask a client, first homework, is, when do you feel safe? It's a really interesting piece of homework. When do you feel safe? Because let's imagine you leave here, and all you need to do is walk outside and suddenly realize, let's imagine you go down to the tube and maybe one of those lovely tube stations. How about those really nice tube stations where it's a lift and you're in the lift alone and then you're walking down the corridor? I don't feel safe. How about when the alarms go off in the subways in Victoria? I don't feel safe. It's an identity. And it's not only an identity, but if you experienced trauma, if you grew up with spectrum states, whether it's Asperger's, autism, bipolar, all sorts of different disorders, you won't only have the event that happened that triggered the trauma. Let's imagine it was child sexual abuse, or let's imagine there was a terrible divorce, or there was a terrible accident, or one of your parents died. I have no idea. The spectrum of what can happen is huge. But if you also had a spectrum disorder, or let's imagine you had some kind of gender dysphoria, or a gender preference that wasn't socially acceptable, all of these things create other traumas that sit on top. So the experience of being Asperger's combined with trauma is actually one of my favourite things to work with. I work with a lot of clients who have Asperger's, borderline personality, and trauma. And then you're looking at literally at a sea urchin covered in wet spaghetti, drowning in wool. Because each of those states has its own peculiarities. Again, it's not a pejorative word, it just means that each of those states, and to work out, is that your Asperger's? Is that your ADHD? Is that the sexual trauma, or is that from the bullying? You start being able to kind of separate it out. And then, hang on, I'm going to get back to questions in a minute. I just have something I'd like to get to, because then it makes more sense in the question. So, the identity needs, first of all, to decide to make safety. So do you remember, if you were here yesterday and I stood up and I said I had a really difficult client, one of the reasons why I stood up was because the thing that if you're going to spend money on some kind of treatment, and there's some amazing treatments out there, and there's some amazing therapists, lots of them are in the room, if you're going to spend money and take the effort to go and do the work on yourself, you're wasting your money if that person doesn't help you, first of all, find safety. And I think that was the thing I was trying to say, is that sometimes the repetition compulsion, yes, to repeat an action expecting a different result, yeah? Einstein? Yeah? Is so strong. And the shame bind, the shame bind, when we have shame that is due to these, and the effect is to fracture out, when our interpersonal bridge is broken, we can get really, really stuck in the that kind of mea culpa, it's my fault, I'm a bad person, I don't deserve anything better. And so it's a complex thing to come out of the complexity of trauma, but the first thing you need to start doing is making safety. So if you're living at home and your parents are continuously traumatizing you, trauma therapy is not going to work. Does that make sense? If you're in a violent relationship or an abusive relationship and you want to go into trauma therapy, somewhere that's got to be addressed first. Do any of you work with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yes, the triangle. There's a very interesting triangle. If you look it up, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's got 5 layers, and the first layer is safety. And quite often people will come and they'll say, I really want to work on my trauma. And I will say, okay, so where do you live? Oh, I'm currently homeless. Can we get you safe first? Could we get you safe? I really want to work on my trauma. Okay, have you got somewhere to live? I'm sleeping in a garage. Do you have a bed? No, I sleep on the floor. The very interesting thing about making enough safety to be able to change the identity. Does that make sense? Yeah? So, I don't know how long I'm allowed to speak for, but let's have some questions. Have I made a certain amount of clarity if we think about the path out of hell? Yeah? But let's see where the questions go. I know there was a lady here who had a question. You have to speak up a bit, my darling. Hang on, someone's going to bring you a microphone. Sorry, because my hearing is on -4, I think.
Is that? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I heard you saying the amygdala is always looking for safety.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes.
So is it like looking for safety plus, basically, if you've been traumatised?
Yes.
I just wanted to get an understanding of how much more that was.
Yes, I can't give it a number, but what it means is, if your amygdala is always looking for safety, what it means is that your physical body is in hyperdrive. And because your physical body is in hyperdrive, so when you're stressed and anxious, you have 3 main hormones in the body. The first one is cortisol, the second one is adrenaline, and the third one is testosterone. They're mainly the stress hormones. Of course there are other ones, but they're the 3 main hormones. So let's imagine that you're an anxious person, and actually it's quite hard not to be anxious. That means that your body is continuously flooded with adrenaline, cortisol, and testosterone. And these 3 hormones, cortisol, oh my God, I've got to get an essay. Oh my God, I'm really stressed. Cortisol is a motivating factor. But like Gabor said yesterday, cortisol is implicated in every single illness. Trust me, you do not want to be living on cortisol. And the weirdest thing is that a nervous breakdown is when you run out of cortisol. I find that really mad, that you actually run out of cortisol and then your whole system collapses. But if you're constantly anxious and you're still living with the effects of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, active addiction, active anxiety, it's a physical contraction. And if you actually come back to that stretch, remember that stretch? Or I teach, you don't have to come to my classes, there's thousands of yoga classes. I work with Kundalini yoga, and I always teach at the beginning all the stretches that clear the body. So literally, cross your legs and put your left hand on your right knee. And if you twist, and then inhale, twist and then inhale, and stretch your neck. And then come the other way and twist, and then inhale, and stretch your neck. And come back to the center, and you'll notice there's a kind of a boom. Can you feel it? You've just said to your amygdala, we're safe enough. And the hormones change. The hormones change. So the cortisol goes down, the testosterone goes down, the adrenaline goes down, and for as long as you allow it, your system has changed. You're now possibly, the twisting releases serotonin. The stretching releases dopamine. If you then went into, let's imagine, holding your arms out, because that's one of the things I teach, is to hold your arms out for an extended period of time with your eyes closed. Once you let that go, you release endorphins, and the endorphins eat your stress hormones. The serotonin allows you to be still, it calms the agitation. The dopamine makes you feel connected. And then from there you can keep going into a whole load of other hormones like DHEA and oxytocin. So by regulating the brain and the amygdala, and by constantly coming in and saying, it's okay, I'm just going to stretch, or I'm going to do something to soften the system, the brain constantly resets itself until you finally get to the point where you are able to notice, that's interesting, I'm triggered. That's interesting, I'm anxious. That sound just made my heart beat. How many of you actually do yoga? And how many of you, thank you, remember, do you notice when you're very relaxed and then someone kicks over their water bottle? Oh, God, it drives me nuts. I've just spent an hour relaxing all of you. Now you've gone and kicked over your water bottle and everybody's in a stress state again. Now, for me, I know that's happened right now. But for other people, what happens with your amygdala is that minute moment might make you go, what was that noise? What was that noise? Can you notice your heartbeat? Yeah? Once that's happened, if you don't come in and stop it, your amygdala then goes, I wonder if it was a bomb. Oh my God, is it going to be safe walking home? Oh shit, what if the tube doesn't? Within 2 minutes, you are drowning in a waterfall. You're drowning in the Niagara Falls of the amygdala hyper-regulating safety. So one of the first steps is to be able to notice your triggers. Because when you start to know what your triggers are, regulate safety, know your triggers. So that's a very long answer to your question, but did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did, that's great, and it just, the idea of how much it affects the whole body, and the contraction and tension in the body.
It's phenomenal.
Which is very much what I work with. So
that side of the body, the sympathetic system, regulates migraines, obesity, orgasm, childbirth, premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, your heart rate, IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. I mean, the list of things is amazing. So, any other questions? I saw some. Yes. And maybe pass the mic, pass it to you. Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Caroline. Really enjoyed listening to you. You mentioned 8 types of shame and 9 layers of hell. I don't know if it was my ADD and I zoned out, but did you expand on that?
8 types of shame and 9 layers of hell. Paradise Lost. No, what is it? Is it Paradise Lost? What's it called? Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno. Yeah, I work with that. I run shame workshops. I've bought cards here. I run 3-day shame workshops, and they're really not a pleasure. Just, it's not like fun. You know, if you know that you're really getting triggered and you know that you're really getting overwhelmed, I do these 3-day workshops. And there are quite a few people here who've done them, and they may be willing to put their hands up if you want to talk to them afterwards. Do you want to put your hands up if you've done a shame workshop with me? We've got 2 people here, 3, 4, several people have done them. I run 3-day shame workshops. They include movement and stretching and understanding the system. So shame takes you down into those layers of hell, and we gently go down there. So that's something that I do. So the 9 layers of hell, the base one is, you know when you get a proper shamefold, when you are just like, I can't look, I can't move, I can't speak. The interesting thing about shame is if you have shame, you will shame. This is a really depressing thing about shame. It's really, and that's one of the things that you need to start watching is how shaming am I being in my shame? How shaming am I because I've been shamed? Now, 8 types of abuse is the main way to get to shame or trauma. And the 8 types of abuse will be physical, emotional, sexual, intellectual, religious, money, body, race, ethnicity, and gender preference, or gender and gender preference. So I work with those different places where we can have and experience and feel shame. Yeah?
Is it alright if I ask one more question?
Sorry. Go for it.
In your experience, for people who from like in the womb, in birth, who were just flooded with cortisol and stress and they never had any foundation of a kind of normal or stability, is it recoverable? Can they find...
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to take a view. I really need you to take a view, you know, especially around some of the stuff that came up around parenting. How many of you noticed, particularly if you were mothers, that you might have wanted to leave the room when they would... Yeah, it's a difficult one. That's a really difficult one. Attachment theory is a really tricky theory. Attachment theory, the government asked John Bowlby to come up with a theory to get women out of the factories after the war.
Please.
So it's in itself...
That's a very biased view of all this.
I know, darling, but I'm a woman and I have to take that biased view because all of the stress goes on the mother. It is a biased view, but how it was originally developed was from that. But I don't want to get in, can we not get into an argument? But happy to discuss it with you. What?
I don't think it was directed by the government.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
No, it's fine, but can I stay on topic? Is that okay? I'm happy to sit with you afterwards, I really am, but I'd rather stay on topic right now. And the topic is to look back, in reference to attachment theory, in reference to being the perfect mother. I had 6 pregnancies to have 2 children. I don't have any residual stuff left from it, but I gave birth to, my daughter was highly anxious, my son is Asperger's. So I've spent all of their adult life, all their lives, helping them work with that, and obviously a certain amount of time getting over my guilt as a bad mother. But if we look back, the Georgians didn't get it right. Were they good at rearing children, do we think? The Victorians, were they good at rearing children? The Elizabethans, how did they do? I mean, even just the Victorians, most women would have given birth to 10 children, potentially to have lived with one. So, these states of being are surprisingly normal, but also my experience from my own diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder is that yes, I can very rarely get very triggered, very rarely, but I still notice, how many of you do this? I look at a plane flying and I expect it to explode. I get in a car to drive down the motorway and I expect to see cars in front of me crashing. If I sit on a plane, I have to get over the fact that I expect the plane to crash. And if I'm really stressed, I might lie in bed waiting for the sound of the explosion of the end of the world. And that's the side effect of long-term post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is you'll have moments where you'll kind of go, oh, that's interesting, I'm watching that plane wondering if it's going to explode. That's just, you know, obviously I'm slightly anxious at the moment. I need to do something to regulate myself. Because I think that one of the issues is that we're not being taught that we can regulate ourselves. We're not taught, we don't teach our children, we're not taught in school, we can regulate. This is the interesting thing. When it's really set as an identity, obviously it's important to make it safe enough to change. But on a daily basis, we can wake up and say, I'm going to stretch my entire body. I'm going to go in and reset the alarm system. We can also say, I'm feeling anxious and nervous. Maybe I might have a stretch. Maybe I might just move all of my body. Okay, I feel a bit better now. And sometimes we'll be facing really terrible things like operations and dentists and meetings with people we don't want to be meeting. But we can still regulate, and we need to learn and teach how to regulate. Because when you start to learn how to cope with emotion, life becomes much easier. Yes? Jane, can you just tell me how much longer I've got? I know it's 2 minutes to 11. 7 minutes, okay. Okay.
Hi, just earlier you were saying about making sure the client is...
I can't hear you, sorry.
Just earlier you were saying about making sure first and primarily to make sure that the client is in a place of safety.
Yes.
Before you can treat the trauma, because the trauma identity can be extremely strong in a lot of us.
Yes.
What happens when you can't get to that place where, I remember Peter Bean saying that treating the trauma is one thing, but if the personality doesn't want to change in line with the treatment, working to a certain point, how can you actually encourage the actual personality?
I worked with quite a lot of people for a long time, literally just doing damage limitation. Just, how was your week, what came up this week, and working with them around what happened, how did you respond, what could you do differently? Until finally one day, so quite often it could be an extended period of damage limitation. And then there comes a point where the light goes on in a funny way, and it's just like, you notice suddenly, are you a therapist, when you notice that, you suddenly notice, now that's interesting, we are working. We're actually now in a therapeutic alliance.
When it is very difficult, does it always happen that way, where you recognise as a therapist that there was even just the smallest light bulb moment that you just described?
I recognise that, but I think also you've got to take a view. Are you with the right therapist? Do you feel safe enough? Do you trust that person enough? I mean, I think as a trauma therapist, I think it's an incredible privilege to work with trauma. And it creates an extraordinary relationship. I don't work with EMDR because I like that relational space. And I think that if you're going to decide to take yourself on, it can be from 2 to 4 years. But I certainly can see somebody at the beginning, I had a client who I worked with for a long time, and they spoke in sort of broken pictures. They couldn't construct a sentence. Everything just kept changing. They kept leaving their body. They couldn't stay present in the room. And, after X amount of time, that person was literally 8 inches taller. I mean, their presence and their ability and their sense of humour and their skill, their emotional dexterity it's an extraordinary thing to have that trust relationship with somebody. So if somebody's really stuck, I may say, maybe you need to find somebody that you can make that movement with. But I'm also will point out, we are doing damage limitation, just so you know.
Thank you.
Behind you there's a lady.
In your experience, people who get illnesses from trauma, if they heal from that trauma, can they then heal the illness?
I need you to repeat the question. People who get...
I have epilepsy and it's related to trauma, but I'm from Belfast and the seizures only happen when I'm in Belfast. So if I can heal from that trauma, can I heal the epilepsy?
That's a really interesting question. That's a really, really interesting question. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor, so
That's
not
okay.
at all. And actually, that would be outside of my realm of experience. I have never worked with epilepsy in that way.
Yeah.
And so you might want to do some research on the relationship to epilepsy and the vagus nerve.
Okay.
And you may also want to explore, I'm assuming, did you grow up in Belfast during the Troubles?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I've worked with that quite a lot.
Yeah.
And you may want to explore what the epilepsy gave you while you were there. Did it give you very extreme care? Look at the identity of the epilepsy. But I'm not a doctor, so in no way could I say yes, I couldn't.
No problem. Thanks for your honesty. Appreciate that.
Anyone else? Yes. Hello. Microphone's miles away.
Hi, my name's Karen. I noticed yesterday when Gabor was speaking about parenting, how I wanted to leave the room, and what I noticed was that I spend a lot of time with my daughter, who I also work with, and I notice now when I get activated, which I am now, that I'm activating her.
Oh, yes.
And then she tries to take care of me and the pattern plays out. Because she doesn't like me, she doesn't like witnessing me being disturbed because it disturbs her, and I understand logically all of that.
Yeah.
And what I noticed yesterday is that my shame kicks in and I want to dissociate and say, you're better off with it. Almost like I say to myself, you're better off without me.
Yeah.
And I just noticed how disturbed I am today.
Right.
By that.
So you've been triggered into some kind of shame spiral.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
And because I'm so aware of it and so present to it right now, and I know how to regulate myself, which I'm, practicing as I speak to you, that I just wonder, the pattern's so strong, is it better to actually separate myself from her or name it and regulate myself?
Okay, please don't separate from your daughter.
So I don't separate, I'm never going to do that, but I mean, spend less time because I see how these patterns playing out.
I think perhaps it's too, I work with my own children, I'm angry. I'm angry and I'm unhappy because something's happened. It's nothing to do with you. I can regulate myself, I'm not angry with you, I just need you to give me a bit of time, and when I come back, I'll be sorted. This is one thing, is to take responsibility and to disallow her to regulate it, not actually to allow her to regulate.
Which I do. Unfortunately, it's not having enough impact because it stays with her and she doesn't do the work that I do, and I can't expect her to.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously she's got her own identity around her caregiving potentially. I have no idea. But also, imagine if in the room, let's imagine that, I'm going to point to Carrie. Can I point to Carrie? Imagine if Carrie asked a question and my answer made her cry and you could hear her voice breaking. There'd be a cluster of anxiety around her. There'd be other people's systems beginning to get triggered, and you'd start to feel rather uncomfortable. You'd be colluding and looking at each other. Because stress hormones are catching. Even though we think we're really 21st century with our iPhones and our Google Maps, we pick up the hormones all the time, constantly regulating. And one of the ways that we really do regulate and how the other person reads us is through our facial expressions. So if I'm stressed and I'm not really sure, and can you see my contorting my face? Can you feel your response to that? If my voice goes up and I speak more fast, and if my hand movements get sharper, you are not safe. So you may want to, I don't know if you are a therapist or you work with a therapist, you might want to look at the signals that you're giving your daughter about your anxiety, and your vagal system is expressing the lack of safety. Because as a teacher, as a yoga teacher, as a workshop leader and a therapist, I'm always aware of, I keep my voice slow and gentle. I keep my hand movements quite gentle. And regulating how I speak. Because if I was speaking to my teenagers and I started doing that, my hand movements got faster and my voice got faster and my eyebrows went up, we'd be fighting. So we had to have a really serious argument the other day with not an argument, we had to have a really big discussion, because there's a friend of my daughter's has been violently abusive to a friend of my son's. Boy attacking girl, they're each robustly taking sides. It's caused huge problems, and we had to have a family meeting. Sit at the table. Here are the rules. We whisper. Whoever raises their voice has to leave the room. It was fantastic. I mean, we went through the whole thing with a whisper, and it was just a really good way of, let's actually stay adult, because here it is. When you're in your anxious body, you're in the pain of the past or the fear of the future. You're not present. And the regulation, allowing yourself to regulate, learning to regulate, allows you to take a bit of distance from the pain of the past or the fear of the future. The kind of pat thing is that the pain of the past is depression and the fear of the future is anxiety. I don't 100% agree with that, but you want to be able to notice what's going on. Am I calm? Is my voice calm? How's my heart? Can I do something about that? How can I make myself safer? That's interesting. I'm not in my adult. Maybe I won't have that discussion right now. Maybe I'll regulate myself before I do have that discussion. Does that make sense? This begins to be the path out of hell. Now, if you are a teacher, or yoga teacher, or you are a therapist, I do run a week-long training exploring the addictive nature, looking at anxiety, shame, and abuse through the lens of the addictive nature, and it does work. I mean, I teach it as a therapist as well as a yoga teacher, so the cards are there. If you know you want to work on your shame, I have a 3-day shame workshop. If your sexual history is affecting how you experience yourself now, I run a female arousal workshop, and I make films and videos, and I have a YouTube channel and a Vimeo channel. So there's lots of information out there. And I know I need to stop because there's lots of other people coming afterwards, but I really appreciate the space. Thank you, Jane.